Thank you everyone for joining, and good evening to everybody around the world. And so today I'm going to talk about animal vulnerability in the context of cyclone and flood disaster in Sundarbans. Specifically, I'm going to look into human and tiger, and I'll also touch upon some of the other species as well, but specifically human-tiger relation, how it has changed, and how we are going to focus a bit on tiger and keeping the human at the margins and focusing more on the tigers and other animals around, and understanding this human-tiger relation, how we can go beyond conflict, and why is conflict happening, and how we're trying to go around it, understanding the vulnerability of the animal. So if you go, the main idea of showing this map is, to give you a glimpse about the current tiger trespassing situation that has happened in the Indian Sundarbans. So Sundarban is divided between India and Bangladesh, and I'll be focusing on Indian Sundarbans, where my main area of focus is. So Indian Sundarban is made up of almost 102 to 104 islands, out of which 54 are human inhabited. Rest are forest areas. So these are all forested areas which habits the Royal Bengal tiger, the Panthera tigris, and other animals like deer, wild boar, monkeys, snakes, and all these areas having fringe villages which inhabits almost 2.4 millions of people. So we'll be mainly looking here, understanding that, in the past 1.5 years, from the late 2020 till today, or maybe like early 2022, there has been 11 cases of tiger trespassing from the forest areas inside the villages. And out of the 11 cases, only one had cattle strain complaints, whereas rest have trespassed and have been hiding for almost 24 to more than 36 years without any attack. And, out of this 11 trespassing, I was there in 3 of the trespassing situation, and the whole search party goes more than 24 hours, and hardly there has been any complaint about cattle straying or attack. So the question rises that why there has been these unharmed trespasses. What could be the possible reason for it? So in order to understand that, I have been doing this extensive qualitative ethnographic study for almost 8 to 10 months, and there are different understanding between the locals, various stakeholders, a forest department, wildlife expert, and I wanted to explain how human tiger interaction is happening in Sundarbans, which we can sort of understand that it has gone beyond conflict. The 3 kind of interaction that we find in Sundarbans between human and tiger is: one is non-physical sighting, which is by the pug marks and feces. Second is this physical sighting from a distance that you can see. Often they sort of do this catch and release once they trespass, and the other one is when a direct physical form of attack from whether on a human or a cattle stray. Giving a backdrop about how a cyclone is playing in Sundarbans, it's not only affecting the locals, but it's also affecting the other non-human, the mangroves, the animals present there. So I've been trying to look into the past 1 decade, from specifically looking into this major cyclone that took place in 2009, that is Cyclone Ayla, till today. There has been in the past 2.5 years, there has been constantly 6 to 7 cyclones. During the COVID, there has been 2 major cyclones, one in May 2020, which is Amphan. The other one is May 2021, which is Cyclone Yas, and recently the Cyclone Jawad, which is like around 6-7 months back. So cyclone has been consistently, sort of impacting the people who are the people who are living in Sundarbans. And when I'm talking about people, I am actually trying to make sure that we understand that it is the human and the non-human who are sort of living, cohabiting with each other. And if you look into the human tiger interaction that has happened, or specifically if you look into the the conflict, we find that, so these are the two study areas specifically I work into. The red one is one study area, Samshernagar, the other one is Kumirmari. So, if you see the green one, you find that there has been sudden increase in this particular village, which is a Kumirmari village. And you find there has been almost a number of fatalities has increased to 23. And specifically, this sudden increase in tiger death has been actually taking place between the year 2020 to 2022. Why? Because there's this new tiger has come to the fringe forest, which is the buffer zone where the local community is sort of they're dependent into, and they sort of go there for fishing and honey collection and different livelihood purposes. So this particular tiger comes from core area, and it has swam across 20 to 30 kilometers, and it has come during when the island, the core island that this particular tiger was staying, it got inundated due to continuous cyclone and post cyclone flooding. And now it has come to this fringe area where it is not used to humans, and it thinks human as a prey, or it thinks human as an attacker or a competitor, and it has been attacking humans. Whereas in comparison to the other village, there has been subsequent decrease in the human tiger conflict, and in the other village there are very few, very less incidences of human tiger conflict. So these are the several map making sessions that I've been doing with the locals to understand when is the tiger entering, in which years. So we have here sort of confounded before 2005. Then there are several maps when we do from 2009 to 2015. So we were trying to understand, which all the areas it has gone inside, trying to figure out specifically the months, because it's usually the month of May or the month of November where the cyclone hits the Sundarbans, or between August to September where flood situation happens. So we were trying to gauge, where the tiger trespassing is happening the more. So there are several reasons that the locals have sort of, interpreted about why human tiger conflict is happening. So the first thing is that, we have to understand that, human have become an easy prey for tiger. Why? Because the deer population has the prey population for tigers have decreased. And again, why that prey population has decreased? Again, because of cyclones and climate disaster, because deers and wild boars, they cannot swim in these long stretch of rivers and seas, so they often drown, which has led to quite the dwindling in the number of prey population for tiger, so which is resulting into the tiger attacking humans. Again, it is very important to understand that tiger is a terrestrial animal. It doesn't like sharing space, and often because of this continuous cyclone and flooding disaster, many core forested islands are getting affected, and they're getting inundated. And because it is getting inundated, the tiger its movement space is getting limited, and hence it is often encroaching to the islands of human habitated islands, which are they are with a higher elevation, in search of shelter and space. And so we can find that there has been also quite a good increase in tiger population, a great conservation effort in Sundarbans. However, the tiger population has gone beyond its carrying capacity, and because of this continuous cyclone disaster, the various islands are going they are submerging. There is continuous erosion happening, so the space is decreasing, the land is decreasing, so are the different preys increasing. One another part is important to understand is often tigers see human as a competitor, because the prey population, specifically the deer, ungulate, and the wild boar, which are the two major prey species for tiger, is dwindling down. Tiger has started to have an alternative food habits on so it is the only Sundarban tigers who eat crabs and fishes. And it is found that even Sundarban locals are actually also dependent on these crabs and fishes for their subsistence and their sustenance. So automatically from animal cognition, tiger sort of sees human as a competitor or an attacker who is sort of competing for the same resources. Lastly, it is another reason that cite for these tiger attack are defense mechanism. So if we go back in the 1980s, 90s, and early 2000s, there were tremendous hunting, poaching, and illegal trafficking of tigers for tiger trophies, tiger animals. So it has made this complete defense mechanism of being killed, and often for defense mechanism, it attacks humans. Another which is very important is to understand is there is a huge cultural and mythological relevance that is present in Sundarbans about two specifically a character you can say find here is Dokhin Roy. Dokhin Roy is known as the god of tiger, and Bon Bibi is known as the god of civil citizens, and they have a pact between them so that the locals will not get into the core areas and disturb the habitation of tigers, and the tigers will not come into the human area which has been guarded by Bon Bibi. But often, because of this continuous cyclone and flooding, there is this boundary, this border is sort of merging, and it is becoming blurred, and both are in search of food, in search of space, is sort of coming in place of each other, and often leading into several conflicts. Another one is very interesting is deforestation. Locals often forage these specific plants, and these specific plants, specifically these three plants, are the natural shelters for tiger. These are also the plants which is highly profitable to the locals for different purposes. And if you look into this tree, which is the Sundari tree, from where the whole name Sundarban has come, it is a salt tolerant tree, and because of continuous flood intrusion, this particular tree is sort of becoming vulnerable, almost it has become almost in nearly extinct position. And this tree helps the tiger to climb during cyclone. So if you see, this has these slanting edges, and it helps tiger to climb on the trees. And if these kind of trees are sort of dwindling or sort of going down, so is the chances of tiger survival for the to survive the cyclone or flood also goes down. Along with tigers, there are these three particular species that is also dwindling. First is snakes. Snakes bites were at rise throughout, in and out, during whenever the flood hits, because all the snakes sort of comes out. But post Ayla in 2009, which has been a major flooding incident in Sundarbans, it had so much of saline intrusion that snakes have died for years. From 2010 to 2013, there has been very less sighting of snakes in Sundarbans. So people have started to pray this particular goddess, who is known as the goddess of snake, to revive the population of snakes, to maintain the Sundarbans ecology, because snakes plays a huge element as a keystone species in Sundarbans. So is deer. You see, this is I've taken this picture recently last year, when this deer sort of flows has come from its forested island to the island that I was staying, and it has sort of swam across, and not every deer sort of makes it. A lot of deer, due to heavy tide, high tide, sea storms, they sort of die during this whole process, and there is this continuous decline in the deer population. So is for the wild boar. So now we have to understand how do we understand the conflict. And often if you understand that human wildlife conflict is how we have always understood the human wildlife interaction, and from this perspective, human wildlife conflict is addressed predominantly in sort of negative economic and ecological impact on local communities. But it is also important to understand from the perspective of animals as well. Recently there has been some scholars working on these human wildlife interaction, specifically with human tiger relation in Nepal and human brown bear relations in Bulgaria, which has shown some instances of coexistence. Often, yes, human and a carnivore coexistence is very much temporary, and it's very much negotiated, which is also similar in Sundarbans. But there are chances of going beyond conflict. While I was talking to my my respondent, I wanted to understand, whether they want tiger as a part of Sundarbans. And more than 70% of the people share the belief that they do require tiger as a part of Sundarbans, and there is a chance of coexistence if the tiger population is checked and more mangrove forested island is sort of created towards the sea of almost 50 to 80 kilometers away from human habited islands, so that these tigers don't come and trespass into human islands. I'm not going to go into these narratives. These are ethnographic accounts. But if you look into these highlighted points, I was trying to understand that what do they mean, what do I understand about the human and the local relationship. And, most of these interactions, I found that they have understood that tiger is important. As you find, all these, whether it's a positive narrative, whether it's a negative narrative, we understand that local people have connoted this whole idea of acceptance for tiger. So if I take one example, it is like, tiger will always be a part of Sundarbans. We all know that, and we have problem with it, but we never want to get rid of it. In the Johurnama, which is the mythical, mythological and ritual book, it says that the human and tiger needs to coexist together. Then only this land will flourish and will never get drowned into the big sea. That is, in order to safeguard themselves from this continuous climatic disaster, human and tiger needs to coexist. Another negative connotation, if you see, is that this one particular village says that they don't have any alternative livelihood, and they want tourism to come to their village, and they want to get benefit from showcasing tigers. So there has been acceptance of tiger in Sundarbans per se. So the whole intolerance to tolerance, this imposed tolerance, or due to all conservation efforts, we have come across that. And now at this contemporary situation, the locals have accepted tiger as something very important for Sundarbans, and it is something that they need to cohabit with. So along with that, there are narratives of shared suffering and struggles. So if you look here in one of the cyclones, this person says that they were caught up in this cyclone when they were out in fishing trips, and there were heavy rains and winds, and they were hiding in their boat, and they see that this particular tiger is also trying to get on this Sundari tree. He's been continuously struggling to manage to climb up, because that particular island was getting drowned by complete high tide and excessive rainfall. And there was just a distance no more than 10 feet between the tiger and the locals, and the tiger has also realized their presence, and it is not attacking the locals or jumping on the boat to locals. And this complete notion understands that both of them are sharing the suffering. Rebecca, you sort of raised your hand. I don't know.
Yes, hi. Just trying to ask you to conclude.
Yeah.
Please.
Yeah. So just like shared suffering, there is also shared understanding of shared space. And from shared space, we understand, how animal vulnerability is also can be comprehended with these different three of the discourses. That is, one is multi-species entanglement, where, we can bring in the human animal aspect together, and they can be biologically, culturally, and politically intertwined. And in order to do that, there is this whole mythological evidences and environmental histories there, where we can bring the mutual relationship of human and more than human world together. And as Derrida's deconstruction of the human animal is ultimately sort of needs to understands that we need to understand why the animal is violent. What is making that animal violent? Why are we making these binary differences? And by applying this whole concept of post-animality from Derrida's essays, what I wanted to know is that, what is to become, if humans are becoming non-humans, or trying to think from the animal perspective, can they cohabit together? And as I finish, these are the different roles of climate disasters, that has made tiger vulnerable, but also at the same time making human and tiger sort of having acceptance and moving towards the valuing the idea of shared space, landscape, shared suffering, their lives getting entangled and going into a space where they can coexist in a temporary sense. So climate disaster, as it makes tigers vulnerable, so for human, but it is also making the both come towards a temporary coexistence with their shared feelings. And that's all. Thank you.
Amazing. So yes, as Rebecca introduced me, my name's Harley. And yeah, for the past 6 years, I've been working in the field of animal activism and doing a range of different things to try and draw attention to the impacts on animals of human activity. And for the past 2.5 years of that, I was working with the organization Animal Rebellion. So for those who don't know, Animal Rebellion is a mass movement who uses nonviolent civil disobedience to try and bring attention to the idea of the role of animal agriculture and meat and dairy in the climate crisis. So we always saw ourselves, and throughout this time, we saw ourselves as bridging the gap between the animal movement and the movement for climate justice. So we saw ourselves as being like simultaneously an animal and climate justice organization, and being this bridge between the two movements who have such aligning aims, but as many people who've been involved in either or both of those kind of grassroots organizing spaces would be aware, are often quite divided, despite the shared goals and aims. So my role mainly within Animal Rebellion was working on narrative. So what I focused on the entire time I was there, or most of the time that I was there, was trying to understand how to shift the discourse in society and bring these two ideas closer together. So bring these ideas of animal justice and climate justice closer together. And sometimes we thought about it as taking this conversation in society around the climate crisis and this increasing concern and like feeling of necessity of urgent action that was kind of like rising up in the public, and trying to attach the idea of animal justice to that, because as many people as well are aware, the idea of a greater sense of protection for animals is endlessly controversial. So if we can attach it to this idea of climate action, which is becoming more accepted, then it seemed like a really great opportunity. It seemed like an opportunity to get real change for animals, and also to really shift the conversation and normalize the conversation of animal protection in the face of the climate crisis. However, one thing that I started to repeatedly feel myself hitting up against in my work was this question of how do we communicate about animals and regarding animals, non-human animals, in the context of the climate crisis, without endorsing or kind of generating these frames of animals as being part of the problem. And for a bit of explanation on this, one thing that is a very common way of communicating about animals and animal agriculture is to position them in the same way as we might talk about oil and gas and other kind of industries that are causing destruction to the planet. So, for example, if we think about communication around animals and climate change, one thing that is often an intention or a desired intention of communicators is to get equal recognition of the role of meat and dairy in the climate crisis as we would have about oil and gas and fossil fuels and other kind of causes or influences on the planet. So this represented this risk for me. This idea that in trying to bridge this gap and trying to jump on this very salient issue for a lot of people and bring animals into that conversation, we're actually unintentionally throwing animals under the bus. Because if you think about it, when you start framing animals as being as much of a problem, like for example, if we're talking about cows and sheep and methane emissions, and we're talking about how methane emissions from farms and animal agriculture are just as much or even more of an issue for the climate as is burning fossil fuels or deforestation, then really what we're kind of comparing is we're comparing something like coal and the burning of coal to something like a cow. And when you think about like that kind of frame and what that's associating in people's mind, it brings up some really worrying implications for then what solutions become acceptable. Because if you think about, if there's something that is causing destruction, for example, fossil fuels, the solution that we're putting forward is that we should end that. And it's the same kind of thing with animal agriculture. We're putting forward that this is an industry that is causing untold destruction to the planet. And if we're accepting the same kind of climate frame that we have at the moment, which is industries that cause destruction should be ended, then what does that say about the individuals who are caught within that system? So this kind of brings to mind, and this kind of, I guess, like makes us think about this idea of framing. And this concept that is really common in political and social change communication, that we are trying to create the best possible frames to communicate our issue to the most amount of people. So one way of thinking about this is that everyone has existing frames in their head. So we're not approaching people as a blank slate. We're not, it would be lovely if we could take our communications and just inject them in people's mind and they wouldn't hit up against any other ideas or concepts. But in reality, this is kind of what we're dealing with, in that when whatever we say is mediated through a person's existing frameworks in their mind and how they perceive the world. So this is their values, this is their preconceived beliefs, this is just inherent kind of socialization as well. And when we're trying to be communicators, we're recognizing that people have current associations in their head and they have current kind of inbuilt core ideas about the world that we're having to try and frame our conversation within that as well. So if we think about communication and we think about framing, we think about these preconceived ideas in people's heads and that people can hold often multiple conflicting ideas at the same time. We can also think about this idea of conceptual metaphors. So we can think that what we say and how we say it really matters to how people perceive an issue. So to return to this idea of animals and climate change, the way we talk about species and their impacts on the planet matters, and the way that we kind of project this idea of what solutions are acceptable matters. And I think one great example of like the power of language and conceptual metaphors was there was a study which looked at communications around crime, and it used different framing and different kind of language use, and kind of then monitored the results. So there was one kind of stream of people who were exposed to messaging which used the metaphor of crime as a virus. So this idea of crime as spreading, infesting, plaguing. And then the other kind of focus group were exposed to messaging which used crime as an opponent. So it used words like we have to fight back, we have to beat back. And in this case, the recipients who received the crime as a virus were much more likely to want preventative solutions. They wanted to be able to treat the problem. Whereas the opponents who got the fight back and the crime as an opponent were much more likely to seek punitive or mandatory sentencing, things like that. So I think the point here is that everyone wants to think that we are these perfectly reasoned individuals who will take whatever information we're presented and come up with the most logical, fair, just answer. But most of our thought isn't conscious. And most of the communications that we do is trying to strengthen people's neural patterns. We want to build this sense. We want to build our stories into people's minds. Like, it's both a conceptual thing and an actual physical thing, in that the more people are exposed to a message, the stronger those neural patterns are in those heads. So in the concept of animals and climate change, this is basically what can happen. When we make a case of meat and dairy being a contributor to the climate crisis in the same way as fossil fuels, deforestation, other things that we talk about as being these damaging industries, what implicit assumptions are we generating for what should happen to animals within that system? For example, if we cause cows cause methane, pigs cause waste, etc. And I bring back to that point of that question of, if we're saying that animal agriculture represents this amount of emissions as compared to transport, as compared to fossil fuels, and we're presenting that those are industries that need to end, and we're also presenting that animal agriculture is in a similar way causing these problems, what are we implying and what solutions are we accepting when it comes to cows and pigs? And to put it quite bluntly, I think at the moment, communication around animals and climate change is implicitly accepting the idea of, for example, the mass killing of cows or pigs in the animal agriculture industries. And I'm not saying that that's the belief or the accepted belief of people, campaigners working in this field, but I believe that the communication at the moment is accepting those solutions as being within the moral framework, or as being justified in this case. So essentially, yeah, this is what can happen, or this is the risk that I see. So I'm going to speed through a couple of slides because of time. But I think when we think about climate communication and just communication in general in the realm of social change, we often focus on a problem, a victim, and a solution, as well as an agent who can make a solution possible. So if we think about animal rights communication, we usually see the problem, so X exploitative practice, a victim, which is usually a species of animals, and a solution. So that's, maybe go vegan, end this practice. And then you have the agent, the person who can make it happen. So that might be you if the messaging is go vegan. It might be a government. In climate communications, we see the problem, for example, fossil fuels, animal agriculture. We see a victim, who's usually humans, the environment, and sometimes wild animals we see presented as a victim as well, and a solution. So climate action and X industry, and again, an agent. And what we often see when trying to bridge this gap is animals being placed in the category of the victim if they're wild, but still placed below humans and just the general idea of nature. Or more frequently at the moment in climate comms around animals, we'll see non-human animals placed in the category of the problem. And this is by referring to the destruction caused by the industry that they're part of. So when we make a case of meat and dairy being a contributor to the climate crisis in the same way as fossil fuels, this kind of builds this idea. And this is tied to the concept of emergency messaging. So it's just how we frame challenges in general. So this whole conference is about animals and wars and disasters. And if we think about disaster messaging and disaster framing, often what we come up against is who are the people who get sacrificed in a disaster. And there's some great research coming out of the UK. I think Britain Talks Climate is a really good one, and also Framing Climate Justice, which look into the use of emergency messaging by groups like Extinction Rebellion, and how, while it can motivate people in the short term, in the long term, it actually leads to this like compassion drain. Because for starters, it triggers people into these emergency response states where you're not able to make these decisions which prioritize the most amount of people. You're just focused on you and you're in survival. So if we're using this emergency messaging and this emergency framing, of this is a crisis, we need to act now, which I think, can be really powerful in some contexts. I think it's really important to think about it's those who are currently the most marginalized in society who are most likely to be left out of then solutions. And in this context, that's often farmed animals specifically. So speeding on, there's narrative and language that do entrench this in our communications. And I'm going to kind of just cover off a few of them and then finish with how we can fight this. So some of the key ones that I see and that I'm drawing a lot on the work of Aaron Stibbe, who writes about ecolinguistics. Would really recommend checking him out. But we have these dominant frames in our communication. So we have this idea of animals and plants as resources or machines, so serving humans. And connected to that is animals and plants existing for human pleasure and gain, and humans are separate from other animals and plants. We have this idea of animals and plants as homogeneous other without differentiation between species and individuals. We can see this in the use of terms like nature or ecosystems as this general catch-all of like, we want to protect ecosystems, or we want to protect nature, without actually focusing on who the individuals who are being exploited or in threat. And yeah, protecting nature and animals is an investment or transaction, this economics frame of that we want to preserve life for future generations because we want to enjoy other species. And this is also embedded through language use. So things like the use of mass nouns to refer to animals and plants. So this is rather than focusing in on specific individuals, it's using like deer populations or herds, rather than focusing on the specific animals who are being affected. Erasing the animal subject. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this idea of the absent referent, which is usually used to refer to, when we're talking to animals, we're talking about animals who are consumed as food. So saying pork rather than pig, for instance. Euphemisms and sterilized language, and this is also tied to using like the language of commodity and industry to refer to animals. So, for example, adopting industry phrases such as cattle or processed rather than slaughtered or killed, and just cows and things like that. So it's adopting these sterilized terms, which often sterilize solutions as well. It makes more abhorrent solutions more acceptable. Disassociative language as well. And the pronouns that we're using to refer to animals, using it, using words like that. But what do we do about it? How do we beat it? So I believe that there's ways that we can challenge this as communicators. I will wrap up right now. Thank you. And I think core to that is how we use language. But before even that, it's how we see ourselves and see our vision as organizations or campaigners fighting for both animal and climate justice. If we don't know what the solution is, then we're not going to be able to present it to a public. And I talk to so many animal and climate campaigners who you ask the question of, okay, and they get asked the question millions of times, what happens to animals? Like if we need to end these industries, what happens to all the animals? And I feel like most of the time, and I've done this a million times, you give the kind of cop-out answer of, oh, well, it's an industry, it will phase out over time. And the animals will just kind of, stop being bred, so they'll eventually die out. And I feel like apart from being a cop-out that forgets all those individuals, that they are individuals with lives, it also doesn't mesh at all with the idea of an emergency response to climate. This idea of these industries phasing out of time does not gel with this idea of this emergency response. So I think understanding our vision and what we think should happen is core to any centralized communication strategy. Without a vision of how we see a response and a transition away from animal use industries, we can't present that to the public. And we can embed that through our language. And yes, I am going to end there with one more little point, which is I think that as communicators, we need to not settle with what communication is accepted now. We need to have what I call like a frame progression. So if we identify and analyze, okay, this is the frame that we're going to use right now to present animals, because it's going to be accepted with our target audience and push them just a little bit further. We need to accept and understand that that's not our end point, that we want to shift society and shift communications further in the direction that we're going, and we need to take and identify opportunities to do that. So yeah, I will end there. Sorry for running a little bit over. And I will stick around, but I might be a bit sleepy. So I would love to hear all the other presentations, and feel free to ask me any questions. I've got my email in the chat. But thanks for having me.
Hola, muchísimas gracias. Primero agradecer evidentemente la aceptación de esta propuesta de ponencia. También pues agradecer a todos los que nos han estado acompañando. Interesantes reflexiones las de los demás compañeros. Y bueno, para no dilatarnos tanto en esta presentación y aprovechar el tiempo que es corto, efectivamente voy a hablar acerca de este tema, lo he titulado Violencia especista y desplazamiento forzado. Y este tópico, este tema lo esbozo desde una perspectiva de análisis constitucional y también pues tomando en consideración todas y cada una de estas transformaciones que poco a poco se han suscitado muy puntualmente en la región latinoamericana. Si bien es cierto, la relación animal humana, no humana, es una cuestión abordada en la filosofía desde pues, épocas muy remotas, esta relación en el derecho pues nunca había sido pensada en planos de igualdad. Por el contrario, dentro de la esfera jurídica, esta consideración de los animales no humanos o bien de los demás animales como sujetos de derecho, incluso previo a nuestro siglo que estamos en curso, pues era una cuestión impensable. Y es que en sí, dentro de este devenir jurídico, también es posible encontrar que desde el siglo XVII se han intentado establecer algunos esbozos de protección animal, en los cuales, pues, a través de una serie de normas y, pues, bueno, algunos constructos o catálogos normativos, se han intentado establecer lineamientos tendientes a prevenir o reducir los tratos crueles que ejerce la especie humana respecto a los demás animales. Y si bien es cierto, también vale la pena recordar que el tema o el tópico a discutir en este simposio es los animales en los desastres y también en esta cuestión pues climática, pues vale la pena también en guerras y desastres naturales, vale la pena también señalar que incluso acciones humanas tan comunes como tomar un vaso de leche, consumir una porción de carne impacta negativamente en el entorno natural. Y esto, en suma, pues bueno, evidentemente ha hecho que pues la forma de vida o el estilo de vida que lleva nuestra especie humana, pues genere o tenga un impacto negativo completamente hacia la vida y el desarrollo, sobre todo de la vida de los demás animales. Entonces, insisto, de ahí es donde parto este tema de señalar, pues bueno, es este pequeño contexto en el cual, pues insisto, si bien es cierto, sí se ha intentado establecer consideraciones mínimas de protección hacia los demás animales, pues resultan normas completamente, pues ya mínimas, que no son obsoletas y que pues evidentemente no hay una plena protección para todas las especies. Es una protección completamente limitada. Y bueno, si bien es cierto, insisto, también en América Latina que se ha dado esta tendencia de un reconocimiento de los animales, de los demás animales como seres sintientes, y que se ha estado buscando esta transformación o esta reconfiguración del estatus jurídico de ellos, de transitar de un régimen civilista de bienes o cosas a una distinta narrativa legal o legislativa, pero lo cierto es que también estos ejercicios legislativos, aunque son muy novedosos y aunque abonan bastante al desarrollo del derecho animal, incluso de los derechos animales, pues realmente todavía vemos que hay una brecha muy importante en cuanto a su aplicación y sobre todo en cuanto a la consideración de qué especies entran dentro de este espectro o dentro de esta esfera contemplativa del derecho que involucra esta protección para los demás animales. Entonces, bueno, dentro del desarrollo constitucional no hay un reconocimiento pleno de derechos para los demás animales, no hay un ejercicio, o no ha habido un ejercicio que realmente permita delimitar un campo de acción o una expansión protectora hacia todas las especies. Generalmente seguimos pensando, y como lo hemos escuchado de algunos otros panelistas, pues esta limitación o esta consideración muy privilegiada hacia unas especies a las que consideramos como más cercanas o pues relativamente bonitas, dejando pues fuera a todos aquellos que, bueno, en una lectura siguiendo la teoría de Will Clay-Mika, pues bueno, interpretaríamos estos animales como los animales liminares o los animales salvajes. ¿Y qué pasa con ellos? Si el derecho, ¿cómo intervendría? O cómo limitaría, que es más bien la expresión que tengo respecto a este tratamiento, cómo limitar nuestras propias prácticas humanas para evitar un sufrimiento innecesario de los demás animales y sobre todo un impacto negativo en ellos. Y bien, nada más a manera enunciativa, dentro de este marco constitucional normativo, los animales no humanos o los demás animales están, pues insisto, en esta tendencia de ser reconocidos o ser declarados como seres sintientes dentro de documentos legales y bien dentro de la jurisdicción constitucional, que se han dado estos precedentes, estos ejercicios en sede jurisdiccional, que es en los cuales se les ha reconocido a algunos como seres sintientes, como sujetos de derechos, a algunos se les ha reconocido sus libertades, derechos fundamentales como el derecho a la salud o el derecho a la familia, pero que insisto, realmente se deja fuera pues tópicos que pues vale la pena ya ir tomando en consideración en los análisis jurídicos y sobre todo legislativos que involucran pues estos esfuerzos de incorporar o de reconocer e incluir a los demás animales como parte de nuestra comunidad jurídica. Y entre estos dos elementos que vale la pena o que yo estoy considerando para esbozar, es este tema de la violencia especista y pues bueno, el desplazamiento forzado, en el cual pues insisto, más allá del tema central de discusión de este simposio, que son las guerras y los desastres naturales, insisto, muchos de estos elementos o muchas de estas consecuencias detonan en sí de prácticas tan mínimas como incluso abrir la llave para tomar un vaso de agua, insisto, este ejercicio tan cultural arraigado de la propia alimentación y demás. Y pues bueno, vale la pena también ya ir señalando que si bien es cierto la consideración y la tendencia hoy en día nos marca una nueva consideración de los demás animales, en el cual pues bueno, hoy por hoy es innegable que la especie humana va ampliando esta consideración respecto a que los demás animales no deben de ser maltratados o no deben de recibir tratos injustos o que no se les lesione innecesariamente. Lo cierto es que en la praxis diaria, en la praxis común, vemos ejercicios completamente violentos y pues sobre todo especistas respecto a los demás animales. ¿A qué hago referencia con este tema de la violencia especista? Pues evidentemente este uso intencional de una fuerza o un poder físico, hecho o amenaza en contra, pues evidentemente de los demás animales, tanto en lo individual como en sus propias colectividades. Y es que efectivamente también si estamos hablando de este tema de la violencia especista y de esta cuestión del propio especismo, esta idea muy errónea en la cual la especie humana ha considerado o tiene como consideración sentirse el dueño, administrador, entre comillas, de todo lo que le rodea, pues también es necesario tomar en consideración que dentro de esta relación entre animales humanos y animales no humanos, dentro de la esfera jurídica ya se ha abierto la puerta para considerar nuevas disposiciones legales y un nuevo tratamiento para los demás animales. Insisto, desde una perspectiva legal e incluso hasta constitucional. Esto pues que nos va a llevar evidentemente a tener que replantear cuál es el estilo de vida que va a tener nuestra especie, cómo ha de regularse o de transitar a nuevas formas que ya eviten esta masiva industrialización, mecanización y procesos de desarrollo tecnológico que únicamente han estado masacrando en dimensiones incalculables a los demás animales. Y bien, el siguiente tópico que es sobre el desplazamiento forzado. lo mismo. Si hablamos evidentemente de animales, animales humanos y animales no humanos, de manera natural se tiende a la migración. Sin embargo, cuando se habla ya de un fenómeno como este desplazamiento, generalmente puede verse y se lee dentro de los estudios jurídicos como un problema específico de nuestra especie. No obstante, es un fenómeno que cualquier animal, insisto, humano o no humano, puede enfrentar. Y de ahí pues esta premisa de este trabajo, que tiene como propósito llevar a la reflexión que muchas conductas humanas representan un constante peligro para el desarrollo de la vida de los demás animales, que implica, pues bueno, que los obliga a huir de sus hogares, desplazarse, pues bueno, con el único propósito de desarrollar su vida o desarrollar, pues bueno, su vida en seguridad o en una idea de seguridad. Y es que en sí esta idea también de la migración, que se interpreta como esta movilidad o este traslado voluntario de los individuos a través, pues bueno, de un cambio de residencia temporal o permanente, en el cual hay un cruce de fronteras geográficas, pues bueno, realmente debe de observar que dentro de esta idea del desplazamiento forzado también hay una constante, insisto, huida de individuos no humanos que a causa de la violencia, de la persecución, inseguridad e invasión constante de sus vidas, pues se ven realmente afectados. Entonces, pues insisto, también es necesario ya ir considerando que si bien es cierto, en estos esfuerzos que se han intentado señalar, que insisto, son muy novedosos, son completamente valiosos para el desarrollo del derecho animal, lo cierto es que también hay una negación de ciertas especies animales en las cuales, por un lado, se busca proteger o se busca limitar ciertas prácticas o ciertos ejercicios, pues no sé, como el combate de aves, pero por otro lado se permite, pues bueno, prácticas como la cacería, que son completamente lesivas del desarrollo de la vida de los demás animales. Por ello, pues bueno, pues ya el objetivo o la premisa central de esta ponencia, pues es tener en consideración que es necesario establecer pilares que nos permitan ir desarrollando una legislación antiespecista. Esto implicaría que evidentemente en esta consideración de una inclusión de todos los demás animales como parte de nuestra comunidad jurídica, entendiendo en sí que cuando hablamos de este desarrollo del derecho animal y de los derechos animales, lo que se busca es también limitar esas actitudes lesionadoras que ejerce nuestra especie hacia los demás animales. En sí, pues evidentemente el primer paso sí es considerar y reconocer a los demás animales como seres sintientes, pero también ir esbozando líneas y premisas que nos permitan desarrollar un trato digno, ético y respetuoso hacia los demás animales, considerando también su propio derecho a un territorio, a un hogar, y que no se vean desplazados o exiliados por estar pues constantemente en un estado de indefensión. Y en este mismo punto pues vale la pena también señalar y reconocer que los demás animales forman parte de un grupo completamente vulnerable, que a la luz de una interpretación de estos estudios de la propia migración, pues es necesario que el Estado también y los estados a través de cooperación diseñen estrategias que permitan hacer efectivas la protección de esas comunidades, y también que en lo individual tengan una protección, evitar, insisto, estas actitudes avasallantes de la propia especie humana, en la cual, pues bueno, esta legislación, insisto, antiespecista, con esta perspectiva antiespecista, dentro de las constituciones se incorporan prerrogativas fundamentales que sean evidentemente justiciables y exigibles, porque de nada sirve ir creando una nueva narrativa o un discurso completamente distinto si no hay una serie de diseño institucional y de herramientas procesales que permitan hacer justiciables y exigibles esos derechos. De nada sirve que dentro de los documentos legales y constitucionales únicamente se quede en una mera buena intención de una declaración de reconocimiento de los demás animales como seres sintientes, si no hay, insisto, todo un diseño o toda esta ingeniería procesal que permita hacer una efectiva protección de los demás animales. Y es que en este sentido, este tipo de protección que se debe de establecer o esbozar o diseñar para los demás animales tiene que considerar los intereses de ellos, no únicamente alejarlos de un sufrimiento, sino considerar realmente cómo han de ser o cómo han de regir o cómo pueden desarrollar su propia vida en términos también de seguridad y en los cuales también se reconozca su derecho a cohabitar y coexistir, obviamente, porque forman parte de nuestro planeta, y que por ello, pues evidentemente es necesario tener en consideración todos estos elementos para ir desarrollando, insisto, una justicia completamente antiespecista. La violencia en sí, la violencia especista, es detonante del desplazamiento forzado de los animales no humanos, que insisto, dentro del que como lo considera Wilkenica, pues serían esta categoría de animales criminales y salvajes, en el cual, pues bueno, el soporte argumentativo de lo que estoy hablando realmente es necesario ir teniendo en consideración que dentro de esta expansión de las categorías de protección constitucional, evidentemente, dentro del derecho contemporáneo es ineludible definir estrategias efectivas de protección de los intereses de los animales no humanos, reconociendo sí que son sujetos jurídicos, que tienen derechos fundamentales, pero que estamos hablando de todas las especies, no únicamente de aquellos que consideramos lindos o los más cercanos, sino que realmente esta consideración es expansiva y bueno, evidentemente dentro de esta idea del propio derecho, ir estableciendo progresivamente cómo vamos de transitar a un orden jurídico en el que la crueldad, la injusticia, incluso la propia violencia y el maltrato hacia los demás animales sean inoperantes, sean impensables, es decir, un orden jurídico que contribuya a la construcción pues de una sociedad pues armónica, pacífica, que permita cohabitar y coexistir animales humanos y animales no humanos. Es necesario totalmente también hablar de una constitucionalización que requiere de valores como la no violencia, con un objeto de establecer pues una base jurídica en el cual pues haya un respeto de la vida de todos los animales sin importar cuál sea su especie. Asimismo, pues bueno, esta idea de la no violencia tendrá que consecuentemente involucrar también a la propia naturaleza como un sujeto vivo y pues bueno, también traerá consecuentemente pues un sentido de responsabilidad y un cuidado colectivo. Es por ello que, pues bueno, para ya ir cerrando con mi presentación, pues vale la pena también señalar, quiero cerrar con esta frase: cuestionar nuestras más arraigadas creencias requiere de mucho coraje, porque implica aceptar que hemos podido estar equivocados toda la vida. Frase de David Fishman, que nos obliga también a entender que, bueno, ciertamente estamos en una etapa en la cual pues el derecho se empieza a abrir, que ya ha abierto la puerta a la discusión de estos tópicos y que sí es necesario tener en consideración estos elementos discursivos para un nuevo desarrollo del propio derecho, en el cual todas las especies, insisto, no aquellas únicamente que son cercanas a nosotros, sino que aquellas que están en estados de libertad, pues se pueda asegurar ese estado, ese desarrollo pleno de sus propias vidas, evidentemente limitando pues el ejercicio de prácticas lesivas que ejerce nuestra especie. Ciertamente los retos son bastante grandes, pero pues es necesario tener en consideración todos estos elementos para ir trazando un nuevo paradigma de no solamente jurídico o constitucional, de regulación o de tratamiento jurídico de los demás animales, sino de realmente estamos en una etapa en la cual pues estos profundos cambios y estas transformaciones, no solamente que se están dando en sede legislativa, sino en sede constitucional, pues que es necesario también fortalecer estos ideales de una defensa de los animales no humanos. Una pregunta que consecuentemente resultaría que sí, pues vale la pena también irlo señalando, cuáles serían estos retos o qué podríamos ir estableciendo desde un ámbito,
Sí,
insisto,
Brenda, perdona.
jurídico.
Las preguntas las vamos a terminar en la sección de preguntas y respuestas. Así que te agradecería poder agradecer y para pasar a la siguiente ponente, para continuar con el horario.
Nada más era eso, nada más terminaba con esto, pues reconocer que los animales son seres sintientes y que la expansión progresiva de derechos y esta juridificación de sus derechos abona ya a una transformación de la conciencia jurídica.
So before we begin, I just want to quickly say that while Stephanie and I are offering some critical perspectives relating to sanctuaries, we're very much coming to this presentation as allies of the movement. We both have had and continue to do various types of work to support animal sanctuaries, whether through activism or research. We also want to emphasize that when we talk about sanctuaries, we also include the broader movements and communities that sanctuaries are a part of. So we're not just offering these considerations towards sanctuaries themselves, but the movement as a whole. I will first briefly contextualize our discussions regarding sanctuaries within the framework of war against animals. Then I'll pass it over to Stephanie, who will dive into more details about more details specifically related to how sanctuaries have responded to disasters, and specifically with farmed animal sanctuaries, and how they might be able to confront these seemingly inescapable challenges and harms imposed on the world by animal agriculture and other destructive industries. Next slide, please. So the first argument we want to make is that wars and disasters are in fact quite inseparable, which I believe has been convincingly shown by some of the other presentations throughout the symposium. This means that our attempts to challenge and overcome wars and disasters are also inseparable. We could understand the connections between war and disaster in more holistic ways. At a more theoretical level, Dinesh Wadawal has argued that our systems of violence towards animals, and so whether intersubjective, institutional, or epistemic violence, all constitute a kind of war. According to Wadawal, this war has a distinctly biopolitical character, where humans exercise sovereign power and encode our total domination and control of animal lives into our laws and policies. But beyond a theoretical understanding of the fundamental relations between human and non-human animals as primarily defined by war and antagonism, we could also see direct material connections between militarism and harm towards animals. For example, we know that the US military is one of the biggest contributors to the climate crisis through their emissions and their resource consumption. We also know that when humans wage war against each other, animals' lives are almost always directly endangered through the damages done to their homes and habitats. Animals are often also exploited by militaries, whether used as weapons in training exercises and in scientific experiments that serve militaristic ends. Many extractive industries destroying our planet by wiping out or displacing entire ecological communities are upheld through violence by militarized police forces, paramilitary groups, and even official military forces of nation states, where their violence against environmental activists, often indigenous land defenders, are sanctioned by the government. So there is a sense in which we could argue that all wars are wars against animals to various extents. Next slide. So with regards to how sanctuaries are implicated in all of this, interestingly, in his chapter on sanctuary in the book Critical Terms for Animal Studies, edited by Lori Gruen, one of the definitions of sanctuary that Timothy Patra cites comes from the Oxford Essential Dictionary of the US military, which states that sanctuary is, quote, a nation or area near or contiguous to the combat area that, by tacit agreement between the warring powers, is exempt from attack and therefore serves as a refuge for staging, logistics, or other activities of the combatant powers, end quote. With this definition, Patchett asks, how might we reconcile the concept of sanctuary as a sacred protective place with a strategically instrumental understanding of sanctuaries, not as utopian refuge, but as specific staging grounds for resistance? We want to hold on to the idea of sanctuary as a place, as a space of resistance, as Patchett conceptualizes it, while at the same time push back a bit on the definition he cited, given that our argument is precisely that sanctuaries are in fact not exempt from direct or indirect attacks from various industries in the form of crises like pandemics, fires, and floods. As Danielle Sellemeyer has argued in her book, Summertime, Reflections on a Vanishing Future, the current state of crisis exists more as a permanent condition continually reproduced by established structures and not as one-off events. This analysis is similar to settler colonial studies scholar Patrick Wolf's argument that colonial invasion is a structure, not an event, and therefore institutionally violence against indigenous peoples, for example, will always be continually reproduced and transformed into different kinds of institutions. Okay, and I'll pass it over to Stephanie.
Okay, thank you, Darren. So farm sanctuaries, as Elaine Abril brightly points out, are embedded within many of the same political economic systems of animal use they seek to change. So we see this in what lands they can occupy, where they source food, medicine, and knowledge. It is both these lands and supply chains that tend to be most vulnerable to disasters, as they're spatially disconnected from supportive systems such as fire departments, and occupy lands that have extensively and intensively undergone land use changes for developing agricultural lands, resulting in compromised and polluted ecosystems. Building on Abril's understandings of embeddedness and this thought that sanctuaries are in fact experiencing direct attacks, we want to extend our thinking to consider biological and ecological relations between sanctuaries and animal agriculture in the context of diseases, extreme weather events, and climate change, as together they constitute direct and indirect challenges to the project of sanctuaries for securing multi-species flourishing. So a few key observations we've made regarding agriculture disasters and sanctuaries and the intersection between them, of course, can start with a look at diseases. So with the ongoing coronavirus pandemic, there has been heightened public awareness and interest in animal diseases, specifically those that are zoonotic. Predating the coronavirus, sanctuaries have had to attune to farmed animal diseases because what happens on a farm can quickly spread. Sanctuaries being restricted and operating in agricultural zones increases the vulnerability for their residents. For example, if there is a disease outbreak in a neighboring farm, the sanctuary itself can be included in what is called the control zone or prevention zone. In the instance of a neighboring farm having a disease outbreak, what typically follows then is a scorched earth policy, which essentially kills all the animals in the defined radius. Or what we've seen this year, the sanctuary itself can be the point source of, or where they've first identified the infection or the influenza. So for example, Pumpkin Wall Farm Sanctuary this year in New Hampshire identified their bird residents having highly pathogenic avian influenza. And so what happened following this is that state workers arrived at the sanctuary, quickly isolating and depopulating all their bird residents, following the same depopulation methods that you would see on a farm, highlighting really that sanctuary's goal of providing a good death is precarious and can still be determined by the industry itself. And then, of course, there are climate threats. So extreme weather events are more frequent and intense as amplified by the climate crisis. It seems every day there is another story of a flood, a drought, a fire, or a heat wave, leaving communities decimated, including thousands upon thousands of farmed animals. As Darren referenced earlier, or Joanne MacArthur in her talk, it is critical to think of these disasters not as events, but new conditions in which we live in. Sellermeyer, writing about the 2019 Australian bushfires, writes that despite having the best contingency plans in place, the wildfires claimed the life of Katie the pig and, in a way, Katie's companion Jimmy, who was left to grieve in her absence, reflecting on the slow violence, such as grief, that unfolds after the initial disaster. However, unlike agricultural sites of production impacted by the disaster, sanctuaries remain ineligible for disaster relief programs. So turning again to the work of Sellermeyer's, who's been really influential in our thinking, she laments that one of the casualties of such disasters is that of safety. She writes, "The very idea of being safe is one of the main casualties of the climate crisis, as is stability and predictability. This realization feels extra heavy on a sanctuary whose mandate is to keep residents safe as possible." Sellermeyer writes, "There is something about animals being killed in a sanctuary that makes it even worse. They were there in the first place because they were survivors of the slow violence we persistently inflicted on them. The few who survived these myriad varieties of slow violence found protection, safety, on a few cut-out bits of land we've left for them. Then there was the fast violence, the violence of the fire, sanctuary over." So sanctuaries are more than ever having to come to terms with the new or heightened conditions in which they operate in and develop disaster management protocols to vary extents in order to keep their residents as safe as possible. So turning to disease. So sanctuaries are developing quarantine protocols and infrastructure for birds during the peak months of avian influenza, such as this year, following a no birds out, no birds in policy. Here with Us Farm Sanctuary in Pennsylvania has been very proactive in responding to avian influenza this year. On a social media post in the spring, they shared that just 27 miles away from their sanctuary, 1.4 million individual laying hens were depopulated because of HPAI. Their sanctuary was then in a control zone. Doing all that they could, sanctuary workers designed bird enclosures with canopy roofs, effectively quarantining the residents from the influenza and falling into compliance with state orders of confining birds. Further, sanctuaries in these moments decide to enforce a no birds in policy, effectively restricting their capacity to welcome new residents despite the heightened need. Some sanctuaries are also taking this moment to educate the public about the connection between avian influenza and animal agriculture. And a social media post, Woodstock Farm Sanctuary, having nearly raised $20,000 for their temporary quarantine infrastructure, took up the task to educate people about avian influenza. So in their fundraising post, Woodstock challenged the narrative that migratory birds were the central spreaders of HPAI, when really the complex relationship between land use changes, agriculture, and factory farms is central to understanding the emergence and spread of avian influenza. Writing, when you look at the media around this virus, everyone is blaming the wild bird migratory patterns for the spreading and contagion. However, far more birds are shipped by animal agriculture than migrate. In fact, billions of birds are shipped for short and long distances in this country every year, and these are the birds most vulnerable to HPAI. It's highly likely that a major cause of the spread of avian influenza is shipping birds who are sick from facility to facility, state to state. So by communicating the link between animal agriculture and avian influenza and explicitly drawing attention to the real threat it presented to their sanctuary, Woodstock effectively and clearly communicated the ongoing danger that animal agriculture poses to sanctuaries, providing grounded experience into the limited protection sanctuaries can offer farmed animals while operating in the ruins of animal agriculture. And then, of course, for climate change, as sanctuaries are responding to extreme weather events, we see an increase in sanctuaries developing disaster management plans, however, unevenly and at times contestably. The Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries has championed disaster management for sanctuaries, acknowledging that extreme weather events fueled by climate change are now conditions sanctuaries must consider. For example, to become accredited by GFAS, sanctuary applicants have to produce operation standards that include disaster preparedness plans and protocols and other supportive policies. Similarly, the Open Sanctuary Project has compiled resources for sanctuaries to consult in preparing for disaster events. However, using the language of open sanctuary projects, the majority of these resources are non-compassionate sources, meaning that they're industry documents that conceptualize disaster management for animals according to their economical value. So in summertime, Sellermeyer describes the disaster management protocols they had in place at their sanctuary during the 2019 bushfires. They had a risk assessment done on their property by the rural fire department. They identified risks such as combustible material and moved it. They considered relocation and what they would need to accomplish that. And they took stock of the limitations they faced, including lacking key resources and something you would not see considered in a non-compassionate resource, the relationship to residents. Like most sanctuaries, they advocate for animal agency. Thus, animals, quote, moved across the land according to their own rhythms, respecting their choice to approach or withdraw. This orientation proved to be a challenge and ethical overture. She writes that another casualty of living in the ruins may also be freedom or agency as sanctuaries try to cultivate. We see this also in the context of biological threats, where the comfort of knowing avian influenza was seasonal and had a peak is rapidly becoming an all-year concern, raising questions about the living conditions for bird residents in the future. Further, during catastrophes, sanctuaries are facing additional challenges in that relying on the same supply chains as animal agriculture, such as accessing veterinarian care or rescue workers or sourcing materials such as food, are no longer guaranteed. For example, following the floods and avian influenza uptick in the Fraser Valley of British Columbia, sanctuaries have found themselves facing scarce and costly hay and having to make the hard decision to not accept new residents in a time of precarity when animals seeking refuge are abundant. So by looking at the relationship between sanctuaries, animal agriculture, and the conditions it produces, characterized by diseases, extreme weather, and the climate crisis, adds complexity to thinking about the embedded relations. They're not just sociopolitically embedded, but they're also biologically and ecological, which warrant our attention within the sanctuary movement, as they're having direct and indirect impacts on how sanctuaries can operate and conceptualize the work that they do. And I'll pass it to Darren to wrap us up.
Yeah, thanks, Steph. So I guess in conclusion, what we want to suggest is that we hope this kind of critical analysis will urge sanctuaries as well as the broader animal advocacy movement that they're embedded in to kind of move beyond traditional animal rescue and rehabilitation work and the kind of responsive work of kind of responding to disasters and crises as they happen, but instead move towards thinking about how to work towards institutional change and stuff that is more transformative through coalition building with other movements that might in the first instance not immediately seem as if there are shared concerns and struggles, and that way we could work towards preventing and future disasters and crises instead of constantly being forced to respond to these conditions that are structurally produced. Yeah, thank you.
Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the construction of an oil pipeline that's underway in Western Canada, and then I'll be discussing some preliminary findings for my doctoral research project, which, as Rebecca just mentioned, focuses on settler or non-Indigenous opposition to this oil pipeline, which is called the Trans Mountain Expansion Project. So the Trans Mountain Expansion Project entails the construction and operation of an interprovincial oil pipeline alongside an existent and operational pipeline. So you can see on the map here, they start just outside the city of Edmonton in the province of Alberta, and then cross the provincial border into British Columbia, where it comes to an end at the Burrard Inlet of the Salish Sea, which is a marine area located in the traditional and unceded territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Musqueam nations. And just to be sure, by unceded, I mean that this is land that these Indigenous nations never legally handed over or assigned away to Canada. And the Canadian government actually owns this pipeline project. They purchased it from Kinder Morgan in 2018. Kinder Morgan is an American Texas-based oil giant. And the current Trans Mountain pipeline exports around 300,000 barrels of oil per day through marine shipping at the Westridge Marine Terminal, which is pictured here. And with this expansion project, this number will nearly triple to 890,000 barrels of oil per day. So it's quite a large project. And concerns related to animals and climate change have really been embedded in the legal processes surrounding the pipeline project. So for instance, in 2018, Canada's Federal Court of Appeal actually brought a halt to the project. The court determined in part that the government agency overseeing the pipeline, called the National Energy Board, did not adequately account for the effects of increased marine oil vessels, both on the environment more broadly and specific animals at risk. And this includes the southern resident killer whales of the Salish Sea, pictured here on the slide. So as a result of this court decision, the National Energy Board had to go back and craft a new report, taking into account the increase of marine oil vessels. And in this report, the National Energy Board concluded that the Trans Mountain Expansion Project's economic benefits outweigh its social and environmental burdens, and therefore it is in the public interest and it should be approved, which it was. And in this report, the National Energy Board stated, project-related marine shipping is likely to cause significant adverse environmental effects on the southern resident killer whale and on Indigenous cultural use associated with the southern resident killer whale. The National Energy Board also finds that greenhouse gas emissions from project-related marine vessels would result in measurable increases and, taking a precautionary approach are likely to be significant. While a credible worst-case spill from the project or a project-related vessel is not likely, if it were to occur, the environmental effects would be significant. And just to clarify, burdens faced by these whales include increased underwater noise and strikes with marine vessels, and then of course the inevitable threat of an oil spill, which would gravely harm the well-being and lives of the whales, as well as their waters and food sources. So overall, the Trans Mountain Expansion Project really links to broader global issues, which we've been discussing at the symposium, particularly anthropogenic climate change, non-human animal suffering, as well as the colonial legal structures, which underlie such matters of injustice. But instead of focusing on law for my doctoral research project, I've decided to orient my analytical focus towards settler activists working at the grassroots level to slow and stop the Trans Mountain Expansion Project. And I'm really seeking to understand how these activists conceptualize the harms posed by the expansion project, but really using this as an entry point to explore how individuals are thinking about and relating to non-human beings during an era of climate and ecological crises, and the relevance of religion and non-religion for understanding these relations. So I won't be focusing on religion and non-religion for this presentation. I'll just note I have been asked more than once, what the heck does religion have to do with animals or the environment? If you are wondering that, hopefully my presentation will still offer some answers to you. So that being said, I want to share some preliminary findings related to climate change and animals that appear in my research data. My data collection and analysis are ongoing, but to date, I've interviewed 29 activists aged 35 to 79 who engage in protest activities against the expansion project, such as marches and rallies, but also forms of direct action, for instance, placing their bodies in the way of pipeline construction machinery. So I'm going to talk first about climate change, and then I'll shift my focus to non-human animals. So climate change is the most consistent response thus far offered by my participants when asked about their motivations for opposing the Trans Mountain Expansion Project. And climate change is most often framed then as a human issue. So by a human issue, I mean, it's acknowledged that climate change originates from human activity, and its impacts are most often linked to the quality or existence of human life. And this appears in three ways. So the first is climate justice or injustice. So recognition that the Trans Mountain Expansion Project contributes to climate change, and accordingly, the inequitable global distributions of the harms of climate change as well. So for instance, one of my participants, Adam, and this is a pseudonym, I'm using pseudonyms all throughout the presentation, he stated, "I think what drew me to climate stuff before I ever heard of Trans Mountain was just this like fundamental unfairness of the fact that the people who have done the least to cause this problem, the people who are least equipped to deal with it, are the ones who experience the worst impacts." There is also some discussion about the impact of climate change on human health, both physical and mental health. For instance, Emma stated, "We know that the youth are terribly impacted by, from a mental health perspective, knowledge of what's happening to our future through our actions now." And then third, discussion about the impact of climate change on future human generations. For example, Matthew stated, "I feel a responsibility for the future generations because it's not looking good for them. And I have 3 little grandchildren, and I'm very, very worried for their future and the planet they're going to live on. So I feel a responsibility to them and to all future generations to do what I can." So addressing climate change for the benefit of other humans, both present and future, is an example of what I consider to be non-religious stewardship. So the concept of stewardship has roots in the Christian tradition. It holds that humans have a unique responsibility to care for nature or the rest of creation on behalf of God. So stewardship in this sense can be thought of as a form of human exceptionalism, and that although humans are part of the earth or creation, just like all other living beings, they alone act as God's stewards. They're exceptional in that they are the stewards. So for instance, in The End of Captivity, Trip York writes, in Christian thought, there is God and there is creation. We, like everything else, are a part of creation. The only significant difference is that we have been charged with the task of naming and caring for creation. So in non-religious stewardship, humans have a responsibility to protect Earth systems and address climate change on behalf of other humans instead of God. So in other words, obligations are directed to humans, again, of the past and present, rather than God. So, so far in my interviews, I've been analyzing my participants highlight climate change as an issue, again, within this framework of non-religious stewardship, highlighting the impacts of climate change on human beings. So that being said, animals certainly weren't absent during my discussions with my interviewees. Most often, threats posed to animals by the Trans Mountain Expansion Project are framed as coming from construction of the pipeline itself. So in a moment, I'll share with you a quote from a participant named Justine, who was talking about her time living in a tree sit that was built to block pipeline construction near a creek. And part of that tree sit is pictured here on the right. So talking about her time in the tree sit, Justine stated, I mean, we have frogs that are hanging out, like two little adorable frogs. Actually, one's quite big, hanging out next to the tree sit. And I always say hi to them when we go by and check to make sure and try not to scare them. And it's like, find my route around to get there. And this is their home. This is where they live. They don't have anywhere else to go. I mean, the reason they're here in that zone and not over in the pretty part on the Greenway by the Brunette River is because, well, people are walking their dogs and there's people running. We've already claimed that. And we made it look nice for us, right? And this idea that, well, this piece isn't useful to us, but it's useful to all these other creatures that need it. So Justine indicates here that the homes of the frogs and other animals are threatened by the pipeline expansion project. And significantly, this reasoning centers on the well-being of the non-human animals themselves. Or in other words, Justine's consideration of these animals is not justified by a reason other than the animals themselves. So I interpret this approach or discourse to reflect the values or principles of ecological justice. So theories of ecological justice hold that injustice occurs when humans disrupt the ability of non-human beings to flourish. Brian Baxter writes that this applies to both what Western thought traditionally deems to be sentient and non-sentient life. So it can apply to the non-human animals, both at the species and individual levels, as well as trees, even ecosystems and landscapes. And ecological justice in political theory is a bit of an umbrella under which there are more specific theories of ecological justice. So for instance, distributive theories of ecological justice hold that non-humans deserve the material conditions they need to not only survive, but flourish. So Anna Wynne-Hughes writes, because life on Earth constitutes an interrelated system, it matters in justice terms how the human consumption of resources, spaces, and environmental goods impacts on the ability of, or in other words, disadvantages, non-human living beings to survive and flourish. So theories of ecological justice in a way prompts us towards equality by ultimately reasoning that humans and non-humans have this inherent right to flourish for their own sake. And some of my participants did talk about non-human animals in more hierarchical language or within these sort of models of stewardship. However, what I'm aiming to demonstrate is that you can still use ecological justice as a conceptual tool to capture articulations of human non-human relations that challenge the power imbalance found in alternative concepts, such as stewardship, where you have this makeup where you have those who are stewards and then those who are stewarded. So to further illustrate this, I'll share with you one more quote from another participant, Sarah. So Sarah stated, "So unfortunately, most of our ecosystems don't have rights. And yet in many cases, you know, like the Nooksack dace in the Brunette River, the Nooksack dace is like this endangered little minnow-sized nocturnal fish that has like 4 micropopulations in BC. And one of them is like right where they're planning the horizontal drilling for the pipeline project. And yeah, I mean, how do you ask for consent from a species that doesn't speak your language? And you know, whether it's nesting birds, cutting down the trees that they have been nesting in for years and that they would like to come back to, but suddenly the decision is made that, well, no, they're not important. And so that's impacting their well-being, not to mention possibly their population. So like Justine, Sarah here once again locates harm in the well-being and lives of non-human animals themselves. So in a framework of ecological justice then, injustice emerges from the pipeline construction because it disrupts the ability of non-human beings, like the Nooksack dace pictured here, and nesting birds to flourish. I won't get into this now too much, but Sarah also touches upon what could be thought of as procedural ecological injustice, indicating the lack of rights animals have in the consent process for the pipeline expansion project. So just to quickly conclude and summarize, non-human animals and climate change are key areas of concern, both in the legal sphere and at the grassroots level. And in both law and in my interview data, there's no strong discernible link among the harms of, there's no strong connections between anthropogenic climate change and non-human animals in the context of the Trans Mountain Expansion Project. However, in my interviews, non-human animals do appear, and there are articulations of human, non-human animal relations that points towards values of ecological justice and ultimately equality. And I will leave it there. Thank you.